delighted to be back in Beaumont.
I have a question for you, sir.
Sure.
With all your years of experience inside the Beltway and being a native Texas boy from Southeast Texas, what do you think of the Democratic presidential candidates coming to Beaumont and spending the time and effort they did here, as opposed to other more populated areas, more important areas in the state?
Well, I think it's a fascinating year. If you have spent any time in politics, and I have spent quite a bit, I can't think of a time where we've had a primary race that compares to this, except perhaps in 1976. I happened to have been the delegate hunter for Jerry Ford against the challenge of Ronald Reagan, the governor from California at the time. Ford, of course, was a sitting president. It was almost knocked off, and that primary contest went right down to the convention. And the Democratic contest this year gives every indication of perhaps doing the same thing. It's an absolutely unique and fascinating election year. I rather suppose that when Texas's primary was set, there was a little expectation that we'd be getting as much attention as we got. Not so much on the Republican side as on the Democratic side.
What is your opinion on Southeast Texas' role in the oil industry since all these plants expansions coming up?
Well, you know, we've got some serious challenges ahead of us with respect to energy. Not just we here in the United States, but the world as a whole. I think Southeast Texas has been a center of the energy industry since the very beginning, back in 1901 with Spindletop. I was just telling my hosts here that I used to spend a fair amount of time in Beaumont because I had an uncle here who was a drilling contractor, and when I was a teenager and in my early 20s I was a roughneck on some of his rigs. Spent a lot of time here in Beaumont at the time, and so I think it's understandable that Beaumont would attract a lot of attention, particularly insofar as energy is concerned.
But then on the other hand, you also hear in the news about all this talk about alternative energy. And
well, I'll give you my take on it, and I don't pretend to be an expert in energy. But my take is it's going to be a long time before we displace fossil fuels as a source of energy. That's not to say that we ought not to do what we can to move toward alternative sources. There's nothing wrong with having as many sources of energy as we can, because there's serious competition today for energy. And as you see emerging economies, like huge economies like India and China and Brazil, jumping in here in competition for energy sources and reserves, it makes sense that we will have to be looking at alternative ways to go. But it's a long ways off. Now, that's coming from somebody who doesn't necessarily understand the science. I was just saying, again, to our host, I don't pretend to understand the science of climate change, but I think that I know enough to know that our climate has changed. Now, maybe that's just cyclical, maybe that's just normal. I don't know, but it has changed. When you see the Arctic ice melting the way it is, then I think it's time for us at least to acknowledge that a change is taking place. We might take a long time to figure out exactly what's causing it.
Mr. Baker, with your experience in the Treasury, what kind of damage is this spiraling price of crude going to do to our economy that's already supposedly in a recession?
It's not going to help our economy, and particularly at a time of weakness such as we are now experiencing. I think crude closed, if I'm not mistaken, yesterday at $106 a barrel, or 107, something like that. When I was Secretary of State and we decided to eject Iraq from Kuwait after they marched in their unprovoked aggression on a small country there, I remember announcing after a 7-hour meeting with the Iraqi foreign minister in Geneva that I didn't see any alternative to war, and oil spiked to $40 a barrel. I mean, that was revolutionary at the time, and people were saying, "Oh, this is just going to be terrible for the global economy." But $107 a barrel is pretty darn tough economically, because once that makes its way through the system, then you're going to see, I think you're going to see a lot of, I hate to say it, but detrimental things. Over the years, Saudi Arabia has actually been a very good ally of the United States. It's important that we try and keep Saudi Arabia as an ally because they sit on so much of the world's energy reserves, at least in terms of fossil fuel. There have been times in the past where they have cooperated with us when we've said, look, why don't you loosen the tap a little bit more be produced to deal with a big spike in prices. They've done that. I don't know what the situation is right now today, but the United States and Saudi Arabia have generally cooperated pretty well. They are the only real producer that has the ability to inject a lot more reserve, a lot more production into the system.
Mr. Baker, can I get some of your thoughts on Iraq? What would you say to a family that may have a son in Iraq right now? What would you tell them?
Well, what I would say is what we wrote in the Iraq Study Group report, which was published in December of 2006. And some of the things we said were, first of all, a precipitous withdrawal from Iraq would be not only bad for the United States and the region over there, but bad for the world as a whole, because we cannot afford to leave Iraq as a failed state for Al-Qaeda. We have something going on with respect to international terrorism today that we've had since September 11, 2001. So we said one thing we definitely ought not to do is precipitously pull out. On the other hand, we do need to figure out how to responsibly and honorably begin to downsize. And we made some suggestions in that regard. We made some other suggestions, such as talking to Syria and to Iran, not just to be talking, but because sometimes it makes sense to talk to your enemies and not just your friends. We also called for a surge in that report. We said we would support a surge if that's what the commander on the ground recommended. And that's what the president has chosen to do, and it's been quite successful in improving the security situation on the ground. What we're continuing to hope for and beginning to see, by the way, is some improvement in political reconciliation as well. And that's going to be the key. Thank you all very much.